You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, hello students. In this particular segment, we're going to address wealth inequality, and we're going to appreciate its historical underpinnings. And we're going to address one of the most important learning objectives that deals with analyzing the varied impacts of historical issues on diverse groups within and between societies. So at first, we're going to take a look at the crisis of wealth distribution in the United States. We'll take a look at its impact, its causes, its impacts, and its responses. So what we want to do is we want to take a look at the contemporary crisis of wealth distribution. If we go into the next slide, then we can take a look at how Americans are going to deal with a similar crisis, but under different circumstances at the turn of the 20th century. Let's appreciate how Americans responded to wealth inequality in an era identified as the Gilded Age. We can analyze the significance of the current solutions to the crisis by appreciating the success that the movements for change had in getting the government to address wealth inequality in the past. So we have already covered some of the issues, but what I want to do is I want to try to rehearse so that we can recognize that we live in cycles, all right, not a linear experience. Let's realize that the United States has been through this situation before where wealth inequality has created tremendous problems. Now, there's a great deal of discussion today regarding the concentration of wealth, including its possible causes and impacts. Now, one of the things that that we are going to rehearse, especially, is Occupy Wall Street movement, and try to appreciate the impressions of the movement and why they seem to be everywhere when the banking crisis occurred in 2008. Now, perhaps the most important, single most important fact shifting America's public attitude towards wealth inequality was the bailout of banks in 2008 and 2009. So let's go to the next slide and let's appreciate the contemporary wealth inequality. What Occupy Wall Street helped America focus on were the causes of the crisis. They deliberately, through mob rule, protested outside the perpetrator's house. They demonstrated on the doorstep of the 1% fixing the rules of the game in their favor. And to the movement, the rule riggers were the source of the problem. The impact of the economic crisis that historians label the Great Recession gave rise to the 99%. And the 99% became a movement, and this movement, their concerns were joblessness, economic insecurity, middle-class debt, a bloated CEO payments or pay, salaries, mushrooming student loans, grinding poverty, and the collapse of the middle class. Indeed, the euphemism on the streets for class mobility, which was once an important dimension of the American dream, became get yourself born to wealthy parents. So much literature has been generated studying both the causes and consequences of wealth inequality. Many point to the ideological shift begun in the 1970s, formulated in the Reagan administration. So let's go into the causes, there you go, the causes, consequences, the strategies for change. Many point to, again, the ideological shift begun in the 70s and reformulated in the Reagan administration as trickle-down economics, as neoliberalism, as austerity. Some economists point to the emergence of credit expansion, the failure to regulate, and the political influence of campaign contributions by the wealthy. Others point to corporate tax loopholes, tax cuts for the wealthy, and the attack on organized labor. The centerpiece of George W. Bush's domestic agenda when he took office in 2001 was a massive tax cut. His administration oversaw the dismantling of environmental restrictions on the oil, timber, and mining industries. The deregulation of financial institutions allowed them to engage in risky practices that contributed to the economic crisis that began in 2007. Whatever the causes, the consequences proved, and they continue to be devastating. An increase in poverty, especially amongst workers, people of color, immigrants, and women and children. And in response to this dilemma, immigrants began demonstrating for dignity and respect, and they resurrected May Day in the United States. Workers began organizing into unions, and they argued for a living wage, calling it the Fight for 15. And people of color were tired of police harassment and the lack of immigration reform. So we had immigration rallies, they had immigration reform rallies, as well as Black Lives Matter. So what assists us in appreciating the current crisis is that a similar one occurred when we started this class during the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, during what Mark Twain referred to as the Great Barbecue. Remember, back then, inequality fueled social conflict, just as much as inequality is fueling social conflict today. Stark inequality led to chronic conflict that hobbled economic growth, just like today. Only it was a different time in the scientific development of the productive forces. While today we live in the information revolution, back then it was the second industrial revolution. Between 1860 and 1890, the availability of capital for investment, the growing supply of labor, abundant natural resources, and federal land grants to railroads contributed to the explosive growth of the economy. It's a little bit different today, especially given the environment and the results of the deregulation of the banking industry. Now, at the same time back then, amidst this explosive growth, one significant impact of the Industrial Revolution was the frequent and prolonged economic depressions. This meant that workers had to endure frequent periods of mass unemployment, not to mention dangerous work conditions, while farmers increasingly lost their livelihood. So, similar process that's occurring since 2008. Meanwhile, the same economy that gave Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan the opportunity to amass the largest fortunes in the history of the world also required that unskilled industrial workers work an average of 60 hours per week for less than 10 cents an hour. Jump to today, and we can see that the economy, we've got Bezos at Amazon.com, we have the Gates, and there's, of course, the Walton family from Walmart's. They have amassed the largest fortunes in the history of the world. So the people's lives were transformed in 120 years ago, just as much as they're being transformed today, where growing urban slums, living conditions became deplorable, diseases rampant. So the Gilded Age came to identify or capture the juxtaposition of enormous wealth alongside crushing poverty. We, in this class, visited Jacob Ries's documented struggle and how the other half lives. People endured the Panic of 1893 and the Depression of 1894 that cemented the social movements for change. We have many different social movements for change occurring today. The crisis in the 1890s was the first time people started understanding that capitalism was creating a deep chasm between the rich and the poor, and that something had to be done. It seems that the people are waking up today. Back then, farmers and workers aligned together to create the populist revolt. What kind of revolt are we seeing today? The Socialist Party was organized and demanding unionization and respect for workers. Anarchists found voice in the starving masses. So historians see in the Gilded Age the period as open class warfare. Historians are now viewing that today we are in open class warfare. The ultra-rich have gained control of the federal government. So back then, the movements for change insisted that laissez-faire economics was not the solution to industrial problems and that the federal government had a responsibility for the nation's social well-being. This protest against monopoly and privilege was ultimately expressed in the assassination of the president at the turn of the century. So perhaps we can recognize that today's movements for change against privilege and wealth follows the path that has already been treaded. The 20th century starts out with a new social movement which bases its principles on scientific observation of socioeconomic problems. The progressive movement came about as a result of the populist crusade, as a result of the capital-labor conflicts and socialist organizing, and as a desire by those who benefited from the system to humanize it. So, back then, progressives came into being to control monopolies, to end the violence associated when workers attempted to organize into unions or when farmers fought the bank foreclosures. A key source to igniting the social movement is ideas, because ideas can overturn traditional values. Ideas can overturn traditional behaviors. Ideas and perceptions of reality aid in generating awareness, which often leads to change. And the most pressing questions are moral and political, and the ideas that were generated by socialists led to progressives using the government efficiently and scientifically to end corruption and to control big business. Throw out the crooks, return power to good citizens, get rid of monopolies, and bring back fair enterprise. So the progressive intellectuals gave us that. We have much to learn from their experience today, and that is why it is important that we take history classes to help us appreciate the past.